The American Civil War, for years of unrelenting bloodshed, heartbreak, and upheaval, stands as the most harrowing chapter in the history of the United States. From the first echoes of gunfire at Fort Sumter in April 1861 to the solemn surrender of Confederate forces at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865, the nation was plunged into a crucible that would test its very soul. More than 600,000 soldiers would lose their lives, countless others returning home maimed, broken, or scarred in ways invisible to the eye. Entire communities were uprooted, families shattered, and the once familiar rhythms of life forever altered. The war was not merely a clash of armies, it was a confrontation of ideas, values, and visions of America's future. At the root of this cataclysm lay an intricate web of economic, social, and cultural divergences interwoven with the central, inescapable question of slavery. In the South, vast plantations stretched across the rolling landscapes of Mississippi, Georgia, and Virginia, their wealth built upon the forced labor of enslaved African Americans. Cotton and tobacco fields demanded toil that was brutal and unyielding. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of a small elite of planters who governed their domains with an iron fist, wielding influence over both politics and social hierarchy. Most Southern whites, meanwhile, remained poor, tied to subsistence farming, and excluded from the prosperity their elite neighbors enjoyed. Honor, chivalry, and a rigid social order were not merely cultural ideals, they were the foundations of Southern identity, intricately bound to the institution of slavery. Fear of rebellion, the specter of insurrection, and the constant need to assert dominance over the enslaved shaped daily life. The South was a land where dueling was a code of honor, violence was a language of power, and social hierarchies were defended with an almost religious fervor. The North presented a stark contrast. Cities and factories burgeoned, fueled by the dynamism of industrialization and the steady influx of immigrants from Germany, Ireland, and beyond. Urban centers throbbed with energy, commerce, and ambition. While the North was not universally abolitionist, its economic model and social ideals stood in contrast to Southern dependence on slavery. Free labor was increasingly seen as both a moral and practical alternative to bondage, particularly as settlers moved westward to claim new lands. Abolitionists figures like William Lloyd Garrison and Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose Uncle Tom's Cabin exposed the brutal realities of slavery, helped galvanize public opinion, challenging Americans to confront the stark contradictions in a nation built on freedom yet divided by chains. Even in the North, however, prejudices persisted, segregation was common, and sympathy for the plight of enslaved people was far from universal. The 1850s were a decade of mounting tension and unavoidable confrontation. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 ignited violent clashes, famously known as Bleeding Kansas, as pro- and anti-slavery settlers fought over the future of new territories. Political fragmentation intensified, the Democratic Party splintered along sectional lines, while the Republican Party emerged with a mission to halt the expansion of slavery. Events such as John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 deepened the national divide. Brown, a radical abolitionist, aimed to spark a slave uprising by seizing federal armaments. Though the raid failed militarily, Brown's subsequent execution transformed him into a martyr in the North, while inflaming Southern fears of insurrection and Northern hostility. Militia formations multiplied, armed standoffs became more common, and rhetoric of secession shifted from fringe paranoia to earnest planning. By 1860, the presidential election crystallized the sectional crisis. Abraham Lincoln, a Republican candidate with a platform opposing the expansion of slavery, won the presidency with less than 40% of the popular vote. Yet his victory struck a profound fear into the hearts of Southern leaders. South Carolina, perceiving an existential threat, became the first state to secede in December 1860, swiftly followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. A new nation, the Confederate States of America, was born. Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator from Mississippi, was installed as its president, and a storm of ideology, pride, and defiance set the stage for the inevitable clash of arms. Even before the first shot was fired, the country was bracing for the unimaginable. Families divided along ideological lines faced wrenching choices: loyalty to state or nation, conscience or custom. Letters written by young men in both North and South reveal a complex tapestry of hope, fear, pride, and uncertainty. One soldier in Virginia would later write of standing at the precipice of history, unsure whether he fought for honor, duty, or a moral cause he barely understood. In Massachusetts, a farmer's son described the unease in his town as neighbors who had once shared meals and worshipped together now eyed one another with suspicion, anticipating a storm that could obliterate all that was familiar. These were ordinary people caught in an extraordinary moment, a prelude to devastation on a scale that few could truly comprehend. The war itself began with astonishing swiftness and ferocity. At Fort Sumter, South Carolina, in April 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on the Union garrison, a symbolic act that transformed decades of tension into immediate conflict. The echoes of those first shots reverberated across the continent. Volunteers surged to enlist, men drawn by a sense of patriotism, a desire to defend home and hearth, or the thrill of adventure. Camps sprang up on both sides, bristling with raw recruits eager to learn discipline, drill, and the grim realities of warfare. But even in these earliest days, it was clear that this would not be a conventional war. Infantry marched across fields without adequate rifles, cavalry clashed in improvised charges, and commanders struggled to reconcile strategic objectives with the sheer human cost of battle. Disease claimed more lives than bullets, and logistical nightmare supply shortages, poor medical care, inadequate shelters turned every day into a struggle for survival. Soldiers' letters and diaries convey a haunting mix of hope and despair. A young Union private wrote of the first winter in camp, "We huddle by the fire, our boots soaked, our stomachs empty, yet we dream of home and the day we will triumph." Meanwhile, a Confederate lieutenant described nights in the trenches, listening to the moans of wounded comrades, wondering if courage was enough to endure the coming trials. The American Civil War was not merely a contest of military might, it was a profound clash of cultures and ideologies, a collision of economies and ethical visions. It was a war in which the boundaries of morality, loyalty, and identity were constantly tested. Every battle, every political maneuver, every personal decision added layers of complexity to a story that would shape the nation for generations. As 1861 bled into 1862, the young war quickly revealed the stark contrast between expectation and reality. Both the Union and Confederate forces had assumed that the conflict might be swift, a matter of weeks, not years. Enthusiasm and bravado had filled recruitment camps, but the first taste of combat shattered illusions. The First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861 became a grim awakening for both sides. Union soldiers, many with little more than drill practice and patriotic fervor, faced seasoned Southern militias entrenched along strategic ridges. The clash erupted with chaotic intensity. Smoke blanketed the landscape, musket fire crackled in uneven volleys, and cannon boomed with thunderous authority. Retreats quickly became routes, and soldiers, some for the first time witnessing the horrors of close-quarters combat, fled in terror. Civilians, who had traveled to nearby hills to watch what they assumed would be a spectacle, now found themselves witnesses to carnage beyond comprehension. The battle ended not in triumph, but in sobering reality. This war would demand far more than courage or idealism. It would demand endurance against overwhelming human cost. In the months that followed, both armies grappled with the immense logistical challenges of modern warfare. Horses needed fodder, guns required ammunition, and soldiers demanded food, medical care, and shelter. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles, vulnerable to enemy raids and natural obstacles. Disease, typhoid, dysentery, and smallpox claimed tens of thousands, often more than the bullets and bayonets of the battlefield. Medical care was primitive. Surgeons worked without anesthesia for most operations, amputations were common, and infection was a constant companion. A Union medic would later describe the operating tents at Fort Donelson as a river of suffering, where the air was thick with the cries of men who would never again walk the earth. Meanwhile, political maneuvering in Washington and Richmond mirrored the ferocity of the battlefield. President Abraham Lincoln navigated an administration deeply divided between radical abolitionists, moderates seeking compromise, and politicians focused on military strategy rather than moral imperatives. Each telegram from his generals carried both military intelligence and a moral reckoning. Lincoln's letters reveal a man burdened not only by the death toll, but by the ideological stakes of a nation at war with itself. In Richmond, Jefferson Davis faced similar dilemmas, sustaining an economy crippled by Union blockades, maintaining morale among civilians and soldiers, and reconciling the diverse agendas of state governors, all while keeping the Confederacy united. The battles of 1862 underscored the brutal and unpredictable nature of this conflict. At Fort Donelson in February, Ulysses S. Grant led Union forces to a critical victory, earning his reputation as a determined and relentless commander. The surrender of Confederate forces there marked one of the first significant blows to Southern morale. Grant's men, weary and ragged from months of marching through mud and snow, nonetheless demonstrated the emerging strength of the Union's strategic vision. Just months later, the Battle of Shiloh erupted in Tennessee, a maelstrom of confusion and carnage. The morning sun revealed shattered trees, shattered morale, and soldiers disoriented by the sheer scale of violence. Estimates suggest that nearly 24,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing over just 2 days. Witnesses later described a landscape transformed into a forest of agony, where the cries of the dying and the groans of the wounded merged with the relentless roar of artillery. Even as the soldiers endured, the war increasingly infiltrated civilian life. Southern women managed farms and plantations in the absence of husbands and sons, struggling to protect what remained of their property and food supplies. Letters to loved ones became lifelines of hope, courage, and sorrow. Northern families, too, felt the strain, balancing support for the war with the anxiety of sons and fathers marching into danger. Economic strain mounted, blockades choked Southern trade, while inflation soared, and the rhythm of daily life became a constant struggle against scarcity and fear. The question of slavery intensified the stakes. In July 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that enslaved people in rebellious states would be freed as of January 1, 1863. The proclamation reframed the war from a struggle over territory to a profound moral crusade. Enslaved individuals, aware that Union armies represented a potential path to freedom, began fleeing plantations, joining the Union cause, and disrupting the Southern labor system. Their courage added a new, transformative layer to the war, reshaping its meaning and purpose. The summer of 1862 brought further trials. The 7 days battles in Virginia tested General George B. McClellan's cautious approach, as Robert E. Lee's audacious leadership drove Union forces back from the outskirts of Richmond. The Confederate Army, though often outnumbered, demonstrated remarkable strategic agility, exploiting terrain, timing, and audacity. Meanwhile, the Battle of Antietam in September brought the bloodiest single day in American military history, with nearly 23,000 casualties in 12 hours. Soldiers described fields transformed into rivers of blood, the air heavy with smoke, and the stench of death. The human cost of these confrontations began to weigh heavily on commanders and civilians alike, challenging the belief that the nation could endure such repeated devastation. Amid the chaos, stories of individual heroism and tragedy emerged, giving a human face to a war often measured in numbers and statistics. A young Confederate sharpshooter from Georgia recorded his thoughts in a journal, capturing both pride and terror. "Each shot I fire feels like a betrayal of my own heart. I aim to protect my home, yet I see the eyes of boys younger than me staring into death, and I feel the hollow ache of what we have become." Across the lines, a Union nurse in Maryland documented her experiences tending to the wounded. "I held men whose limbs were gone, yet whose spirit clung fiercely to life. I became their confessor, their comfort, and their witness. Every life saved felt like a small victory in an ocean of despair." By the end of 1862, it was clear that the war would not be brief. Northern and Southern societies alike had been transformed economically, politically, and emotionally. Military leaders, grappling with the scale of loss and the complexity of supply lines and troop movements, began to innovate. Railroads became vital arteries of war, telegraphs a tool of coordination, and the mobilization of industry reshaped the Union's capacity for sustained conflict. Yet every victory brought new questions, every defeat a painful reminder of vulnerability. The war was not only a test of armies, but a test of national endurance, resilience, and moral clarity. By the dawn of 1863, the American Civil War had reached a crucial inflection point. Both the Union and the Confederacy had endured a brutal 18 months of fighting, with bloodshed and hardship exacting a toll on every level of society. The human cost had become undeniable, families shattered, cities strained under the weight of displaced populations, and soldiers hardened yet haunted by the horrors they had witnessed. Yet amidst the despair, moments of courage and vision would come to define the course of the nation's destiny. The Emancipation Proclamation, effective January 1, 1863, had transformed the Union war effort. Slavery was no longer merely a regional concern or economic system. It had become a moral and ideological imperative, a cause that galvanized support both at home and abroad. Freedmen, escaping the bonds of enslavement, flooded Union lines, bringing not only labor, but also an unyielding determination to fight for liberty. African American regiments, such as the famed 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, faced prejudice and doubt from some white officers. Yet their valor on the battlefield silenced critics and inspired a nation struggling to reconcile its ideals with its practices. At Fort Wagner, the 54th charged into nearly impossible odds, enduring withering fire, demonstrating that courage and sacrifice transcended color and altering perceptions of what freedom could demand. On the battlefield, 1863 proved decisive. The Battle of Chancellorsville in May showcased Robert E. Lee's audacity and tactical brilliance. Against a Union force twice his size, Lee executed a series of maneuvers that stunned the North, exploiting terrain, timing, and the element of surprise. Yet even in victory, the Confederacy suffered an irreplaceable loss. Lieutenant General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, one of Lee's most trusted commanders, was mortally wounded by friendly fire. The news reverberated through both armies, highlighting the fragility of life amidst the chaos of war and underscoring the paradox of triumph tinged with grief. The summer brought to battles that would define the trajectory of the conflict, Vicksburg and Gettysburg. At Vicksburg, General Ulysses S. Grant's strategic brilliance and relentless pressure culminated in a siege that would last over 40 days. Confederate forces, trapped and starving, finally surrendered on July 4, 1863, granting the Union control of the Mississippi River and effectively bisecting the Confederacy. Grant's victory was not merely military, it was psychological. The Mississippi, once a symbol of Southern resilience, now flowed under Union dominance, signaling the inexorable march of Northern power. Concurrently, the Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1 to July 3, became a crucible of endurance, strategy, and human courage. Lee's army, emboldened by prior victories, ventured into Northern territory, seeking a decisive blow that might force the Union to negotiate. The clash unfolded over 3 days in rolling hills, wheat fields, and rocky ridges, with casualty figures staggering: over 51,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. The infamous Pickett's charge on the final day epitomized the harrowing nature of Civil War combat. Confederate soldiers, advancing across open fields under relentless artillery and rifle fire, faced near certain annihilation, yet pressed forward with valor born of duty, belief, and desperation. Union forces, entrenched and determined, absorbed the assault, turning the tide of the battle and, symbolically, the war itself. Gettysburg marked the high water point for the Confederacy and the beginning of a slow, inexorable decline in Southern military fortunes. Beyond the fields of combat, the war reshaped civilian life. Northern cities, teeming with soldiers, laborers, and refugees, became crucibles of innovation and strain. Factories churned day and night, producing rifles, uniforms, and munitions on a scale unprecedented in American history. Women took on expanded roles in hospitals, offices, and production lines, challenging traditional notions of gender and capability. Southern society, meanwhile, struggled under blockade, inflation, and the loss of enslaved labor. Plantations that had once thrived on the institution of slavery now faced collapse, and Southern civilians endured mounting scarcity, dislocation, and fear. Letters, diaries, and newspapers reveal a population grappling not only with survival, but with questions of morality, loyalty, and identity. Political and international dimensions of the war grew in tandem with the battlefield. Lincoln, mindful of European perceptions, framed the conflict as a moral crusade against slavery, hoping to dissuade Britain and France from recognizing or aiding the Confederacy. In the North, the Republican Party consolidated power, while dissenting voices, Copperheads, and others opposed to war continued to stir controversy. In the South, Jefferson Davis faced mounting pressure to maintain unity among states with diverse priorities, while civilian morale fluctuated with every battle report. Each telegram, dispatch, and newspaper report carried weight not only for strategy, but for the very psyche of a nation in the throes of transformation. The winter of 18,631,864 offered no respite. Soldiers recuperated, retrained, and reflected, while generals analyzed the year's bloody campaigns. The Union's growing industrial capacity, combined with strategic control of critical transport routes and rivers, laid the foundation for future offensives. Meanwhile, the Confederacy, though resilient, faced increasing shortages, desertions, and the psychological toll of repeated setbacks. Families in Richmond and Atlanta counted the days, praying for victory while burying loved ones lost to battles that seemed endless and merciless. Throughout this pivotal year, stories of human courage, despair, and endurance abounded. Soldiers scribbled letters under candlelight, capturing fleeting moments of clarity and longing. "I write with trembling hands, for the thought of what tomorrow brings chills me to the bone," wrote one Union private. A Southern mother, rationing meager supplies, confided in her journal, "The children ask where father is, and I cannot answer without breaking my heart. Yet we endure, for to yield would be to surrender our very souls." These accounts reveal the war not merely as strategy and politics, but as lived experience, a crucible in which the essence of the nation, and of humanity itself, was tested. By the end of 1863, it was evident that the war had entered a new phase. Union victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg bolstered morale, solidified international perceptions, and demonstrated the strategic potential of coordinated, sustained military campaigns. The Emancipation Proclamation's impact continued to reverberate, transforming the Union Army and defining the moral stakes of the conflict. Both sides had endured unimaginable loss, yet the nation, scarred and transformed, pressed onward. The struggle for identity, freedom, and survival would continue, with the promise of liberation and the shadow of sacrifice entwined in every campaign, every battle, and every life touched by the conflict. By early 1864, the war had reached a stage of total attrition. Both North and South had endured 3 long years of unimaginable bloodshed, but the tide was beginning to turn decisively in the Union's favor. Ulysses S. Grant, appointed General-in-Chief of all Union armies in March, understood that victory would require relentless pressure, coordinated campaigns, and the willingness to accept staggering human costs. His strategy was simple yet uncompromising: engage Confederate forces continuously, deprive them of resources, and bring the war to the very heart of Southern society. The cost would be high, but for Grant, hesitation was a luxury neither the Union nor humanity could afford. In Virginia, Grant faced Robert E. Lee in a series of brutal confrontations known collectively as the Overland Campaign. From the dense wilderness of the Wilderness to the bloody fields of Spotsylvania Courthouse and Cold Harbor, Union and Confederate soldiers endured a nightmarish cycle of attack, counterattack, and entrenchment. The fighting was merciless. At Cold Harbor, in June 1864, Union forces advanced across open fields into a hailstorm of Confederate rifle fire. Thousands fell within minutes, the screams of the wounded mingling with the roar of artillery. Yet, despite these staggering losses, Grant pressed on, knowing that sustained pressure would eventually overwhelm Lee's already depleted forces. Unlike earlier commanders, he was unafraid of high casualties, believing that the moral imperative of preserving the Union justified the human cost. Meanwhile, in the Deep South, Major General William Tecumseh Sherman embarked on his infamous March to the Sea, a campaign designed to break the Confederacy's will as much as its armies. Beginning in Atlanta, after a hard-fought siege, Sherman's forces carved a path of destruction through Georgia, leaving railroads torn, crops burned, and towns abandoned. While controversial for its scorched earth tactics, the march demonstrated the Union's capacity to wage total war, bringing the reality of defeat directly to the civilian population. Freedmen followed Sherman's columns, seeking refuge and new opportunity, while Confederate civilians faced the grim realization that the war had come to their doorstep in full force. Savannah fell in December, and Sherman presented it to Lincoln as a Christmas gift, symbolizing the inexorable collapse of the Confederate infrastructure. In the political sphere, Lincoln faced his own battles. The 1864 presidential election approached amid war fatigue and political division. Radical Republicans demanded harsher measures against the South and faster emancipation, while Democrats accused Lincoln of mismanagement and called for peace negotiations. Yet Lincoln's steadfast leadership, commitment to Union victory, and moral clarity resonated with the electorate. Victory in the fall of Atlanta and other strategic successes buoyed Northern spirits, and in November, Lincoln was re-elected, a mandate to see the war to its end and to reshape the nation in the aftermath of slavery. In the spring of 1865, the Confederacy, exhausted, cornered, and starving, faced inevitable collapse. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, once the symbol of Southern resilience and tactical brilliance, was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and cut off from essential supplies. In a final, desperate series of retreats and engagements, Union forces pursued Lee relentlessly, forcing him to abandon Richmond and Petersburg. On April 9, 1865, at the Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered to Grant. The ceremony was somber yet dignified. The men, weary and ragged, faced an uncertain future, yet the surrender marked the end of 4 years of relentless destruction and the beginning of a nation's painful journey toward reconciliation. Across the devastated South, civilians confronted ruin. Cities lay in ashes, fields were fallow, and the once structured social order had collapsed. Former slaves, suddenly free, faced both opportunity and peril as they navigated the treacherous terrain of Reconstruction, claiming rights promised by the Constitution yet often denied by entrenched resistance. The legacy of slavery, economic disparity, and social upheaval would echo through decades, shaping the identity and politics of the South long after the final cannon had fallen silent. The war's toll was staggering. Over 600,000 soldiers dead, countless more maimed or psychologically scarred, families torn apart, and communities decimated. Yet from the devastation emerged a transformed United States. Slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment, and the notion of a unified nation, indivisible and committed to liberty, was reaffirmed, albeit incompletely. Veterans returned home to rebuild their lives, carrying memories of heroism, suffering, and the bonds forged in battle. The stories of ordinary soldiers, nurses, and civilians of courage under fire, sacrifice, and enduring hope became part of the enduring American narrative. The Civil War had tested the very essence of the nation. It revealed the contradictions inherent in a democracy founded on liberty, yet maintained through bondage. It demonstrated the devastating cost of division and the human capacity for both cruelty and courage. And it left a profound lesson that the pursuit of justice, freedom, and equality is never without sacrifice, and that the moral and political decisions made during such crises define the character of a nation for generations to come. In reflecting upon the final campaigns and the surrender at Appomattox, one sees the Civil War not simply as a military conflict, but as a crucible of national identity. It was a moment in which ideals were weighed against reality, morality clashed with expediency, and ordinary people, soldiers, women, and civilians found themselves at the center of history's unforgiving gaze. The scars it left were physical, social, and psychological, yet they bore testimony to resilience, endurance, and the enduring hope that the United States could emerge from its darkest hour stronger, united, and more committed to the principles upon which it was founded. As the guns fell silent in 1865, the United States faced a new and equally formidable challenge: reconstruction not of armies and fortifications, but of a nation fractured in every conceivable way. The physical devastation of the South was only the beginning. Cities like Richmond, Atlanta, and Charleston had been reduced to rubble, plantations and farms lay in ruin, and railroads and ports that had sustained the Southern economy were destroyed. But even more profound was the psychological and moral challenge: how to reunite a people torn by ideology, entrenched social hierarchies, and the bitter memories of war. Freedmen, the formerly enslaved, stood at the threshold of a new, uncertain life. The Emancipation Proclamation had declared them free, and the 13th Amendment had codified that freedom into law, but freedom alone was not enough. Many had no land, no economic resources, and few legal protections. They faced the daunting task of claiming a place in a society that had systematically denied them rights, autonomy, and dignity for generations. Schools, churches, and mutual aid societies became beacons of hope, providing education, spiritual solace, and organizational power in the face of hostile white supremacist backlash. Meanwhile, Reconstruction governments, supported by federal troops, attempted to rebuild the Southern political landscape, granting unprecedented rights to black men to vote and hold office. The period was brief, turbulent, and violently contested, but it marked a profound experiment in democracy, civil rights, and national reconciliation. The North, while victorious, was not untouched by the war's devastation. Cities had suffered, economies had been strained, and the collective trauma of 600,000 dead weighed heavily. Veterans returned home bearing scars visible and invisible, and families mourned loved ones whose names were etched into the annals of memory, but whose voices would never again echo across the battlefield. Monuments and cemeteries sprang up, not merely as symbols of grief, but as tools to shape memory, honor sacrifice, and frame a narrative of heroism and national unity. Public memory would be contested for decades, as the North and South remembered the war differently, emphasizing valor, loss, or moral righteousness according to perspective. The political landscape of the post-war era was equally complex. President Lincoln's assassination in April 1865 left a nation grieving and politically adrift, thrusting Andrew Johnson into the presidency. Johnson's approach to Reconstruction, often lenient toward former Confederates, clashed with radical Republicans in Congress, leading to bitter disputes over the direction of Southern recovery and the protection of newly won rights for Black Americans. These struggles set the stage for the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, Jim Crow laws, and a century-long battle over civil rights, illustrating how the war's consequences reverberated far beyond the battlefield. Culturally, the Civil War reshaped the American identity. Literature, art, and oratory explored its themes endlessly: the nobility of sacrifice, the horror of combat, and the moral imperative of freedom. Walt Whitman's drum taps captured the voices of ordinary soldiers, while battlefield photography, such as the work of Matthew Brady, forced the public to confront the stark reality of war. Communities preserved memory through storytelling, regimental reunions, and commemorations, ensuring that the lessons and costs of the war would not fade from consciousness. Even today, the war's legacy informs debates over equality, civil rights, and the meaning of American democracy. The war, in the final analysis, was a crucible of identity. It exposed the tensions between liberty and bondage, democracy and hierarchy, moral conscience and political expediency. It demanded unimaginable sacrifice and imposed a reckoning that stretched across generations. For every soldier who fell, every family shattered, and every community scarred. The Civil War was both an ending and a beginning of violent rupture that forced a nation to confront the contradictions at its core and to redefine itself in the light of freedom, justice, and unity. The story of the American Civil War does not conclude with Appomattox or the signing of amendments. It extends into the ongoing struggle to fulfill the promises that were made possible. The echoes of battlefields resonate in the nation's ongoing debates about civil rights, justice, and equality. The courage, suffering, and moral fortitude of those who lived through the era remain a timeless testament to the cost of liberty and the enduring human desire to build a more just world. The American Civil War was not simply a chapter in history, it was an epical transformation, a moral reckoning, and an enduring narrative that continues to define what it means to be an American.